forms and make sure her health insurance hadn't lapsed. In the 18 years they'd been married, she'd become so dependent on him. He took care of all the little problems in her life, and most of the big ones. It was like living in a hermetically sealed world, with Ollie always there to protect her. Madison Avenue had been good to him, and at 44 he was the number 3 man at Hinckley, Burroughs & Dawson, one of the biggest ad agencies in the country. He had brought in their 4 biggest accounts himself, and he was valuable to the firm and respected among his peers. He had been one of the youngest vice presidents in the business, and she was proud of him. But it still scared her. What was she doing out here, in pretty little Purchase, watching the snow fall and waiting for the kids to come home, while she pretended to write a story that would never be written, that would never end, that would never go anywhere, just like the others she had tried to write in the last 2 years. She had decided to go back to writing on the eve of her 39th birthday. It had been an important decision for her. 39 had actually been worse than turning 40. By 40, she was resigned to impending doom, as she woefully called it. Oliver took her to Europe alone for a month for her 40th birthday. She had scribbled constantly during the trip and filled 7 notebooks, but when she got home, nothing. None of it wanted to be woven into stories or tales or articles or even poems. She just sat there, staring at her notebooks and a blank page in her typewriter that she never seemed to fill. She was still doing it a year and a half later. At 41, she felt as though her entire life were behind her, and Oliver always laughed at her when she said it. "Christ, Sarah, you haven't changed a bit since I met you," he always said. And he meant it. It had taken him exactly 2 years to convince her to marry him after her Soho days. At 23, she had become Mrs. Oliver Watson. 3 weeks after they got back from the honeymoon, Sarah felt oddly nauseous, but she had been religious about using her diaphragm, and she knew she couldn't be pregnant. But much to her chagrin, she was. Sarah was horrified at the thought of having children so quickly. She had quit the gallery-sitting job as soon as she married Ollie, but she'd been thinking of getting a job, perhaps as a literary editor at a magazine. "You can get a job later," he reasoned with her. He comforted, he cajoled, he did everything he could to try to make her feel better, and eventually she agreed to have the baby. Benjamin Watson arrived with a shock of bright red hair and a look of astonishment in his bright eyes, exactly 9 months and 3 days after his parents' wedding. He looked anxious to discover the world and cried a lot. He had Sarah's looks, her determination, her stubbornness, and her fiery temper. Sarah resigned herself to a couple of years of motherhood before she could go back to writing. She'd given up the idea of a job. She wanted to write a novel. Eventually, everything started to look up when she went to the doctor for a bad case of the flu and discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was no anger. There was simply despair. Benjamin wasn't even out of diapers, and now there would be 2 of them. They argued about an abortion, but Oliver talked her out of it. He got a raise when she was halfway through the pregnancy and spent every penny of it hiring a woman to come in and help her with Benjamin 3 afternoons a week. Suddenly, Sarah could go out, to libraries, to meet friends, to art galleries and museums, and her disposition improved immeasurably. Melissa was born when Benjamin was 2, and just months after that, the little family moved from their apartment in Manhattan to the house in Purchase. By the time Melissa was in school, Sarah told herself, she would go back to writing. But somehow there was no time anymore. She did volunteer work, ran errands, worked in the garden. It was a hell of a switch for the once assistant editor of the Crimson. When Benjamin was 7 and Melissa 5, Ollie took Sarah away for a romantic week in Jamaica. Sarah had known him for 12 years, been married to him for 8, and yet she felt as though their romance was still fresh, and it was obvious that Oliver felt the same about Sarah. He devoured her with the energy of an 18-year-old. A month later, one day when he came home from work, Sarah spoke to him in a whisper, from an abyss of despair. "I'm pregnant." The baby came on Election Day, and in spite of her promises not to give a damn about this baby she didn't want so much, Sarah fell ardently in love with him from the first instant she held him. Sam was her baby. Unlike the others, he was no crier, no screamer, just an easy, peaceful, happy baby, right from the beginning. To make matters easier, Ollie had hired a housekeeper named Agnes for her. But before Sarah knew it, Benjamin was suddenly 17 and in his last year of high school, Melissa 15, and Sam 9. They were all undemanding of their mother's attention, which left Sarah with no reason whatsoever why she couldn't.